Back when I was an American public school student, and even when I went to college here, we had our requisite lessons on World War II.
Mussolini had to be. His people were growing restless. Fascism hadn't produced the heaven on earth that he had promised them. So he pulled the old trick of launching a foreign war to divert attention from troubles at home.
We were taught about the evils of tyrants and concentration camps, and the deadly consequences of an authoritarian personality when taken to its most dangerous extremes. And how that power and the fear it generated could turn ordinary human beings subjected to it into monsters who would turn on one another, allowing abominable atrocities to happen to their fellow human beings simply by turning a blind eye to each other's suffering. But as a Midwestern girl growing up in the 80s, I don't recall ever learning about what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. 80 years ago, right here in America, known widely throughout the world as the land of the free. That's when the US government ordered between 110,000 and 120,000 Japanese American citizens, men, women, and children, from their homes and businesses and schools to be forcibly detained in military-style camps in remote areas of the West. Based not upon crimes committed, but solely upon their ancestry. And the pretense of suspicion.
Evacuation. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great.
As a continuance of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first law to restrict U.S. immigration and specifically a prohibition on Chinese laborers, the Asian Exclusion Act was passed as part of the Immigration Act of 1924, a race-specific legislation which barred additional immigration from Asian countries, including Japan, and also declared Asians ineligible for naturalization, leaving Asian immigrants in America unable to become citizens and therefore unable to own land. It was considered the most stringent U.S. immigration policy in the nation's history up until that time.
You are about to see the second of 3 films which have been made to help us size up our enemy, Japan. To beat the Japanese and to do the job thoroughly, we have got to understand them thoroughly. The Japanese are not easy to know. I've lived among them for 10 years. And I can testify that they are as different from ourselves as any people on this planet.
By World War II, some 127,000 Japanese people were living on the U.S. mainland, but more than 112,000 specifically lived along the West Coast. Of that, more than half were at that point second or third generation, and so had been born in America. Stoked in no small part by some pretty nasty propaganda in the newspapers, the fire of the American public's anti-Japanese sentiment and fears that Japanese Americans were a, quote, fifth column loyal to Imperial Japan grew during the war, and were only stoked further by the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941.
Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor, America's mid-Pacific naval bastion. On December 7, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow.
This is a Life magazine from September 24th, 1945. For a long time, the official explanation of Pearl Harbor was that we were slugged without warning when we were innocently going about our business. But to say that we were slugged without warning is a radical distortion of the truth. Roosevelt, the chief executive of the nation and the commander-in-chief of its Army and Navy, knew in advance that the Japanese were going to attack us. And it goes on further in the article to point this out, that they may not have known the precise location of the attack, but the Japanese code had been solved for some time, and they knew that they were launching an attack against us, and we were not preparing our Army and Navy and Air Force to withstand that attack. In fact, in many cases, what we were doing was even making sure that we could be attacked.
It wasn't long afterward, on January 14, 1942, that President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Presidential Proclamation No. 2537, requiring all non-U.S. citizens from the World War II enemy countries of Germany, Italy, and Japan to register with the U.S. Department of Justice. Each person who registered was issued a certificate of identification for aliens of enemy nationality. Just a month later, on February 19, 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, paving the way for the eventual forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. It read in part, "By virtue of the authority vested in me as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of War and the military commanders whom he may from time to time designate to prescribe military areas in such places and of such extent as he or the appropriate military commander may determine, from which any or all persons may be excluded, and with respect to which the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restrictions the Secretary of War or the appropriate military commander may impose in his discretion." Order 9066 claimed to be out of, quote, military necessity. The West Coast was promptly divided into military zones, and Japanese Americans were to be militarily excluded and removed from these zones. Commander Lieutenant General John DeWitt signed 108 civilian exclusion orders at the Western Defense Command headquarters in the Presidio, San Francisco. The West was placed under what newspapers at the time referred to as limited martial law. Not long after, on March 21, 1942, FDR signed Public Law 77-503 in order to enforce his executive order. It had been approved by both the Senate and House after less than 2 hours of discussion total. It wouldn't come out until years later that not one but 2 reports commissioned by President Roosevelt would inform him that Japanese Americans were loyal to the country and posed no security threat. The first one, titled The Report on Japanese on the West Coast of the United States, came to be known as the Munson Report, after Chicago businessman Curtis B. Munson was commissioned as a special representative to the State Department in order to investigate Japanese Americans specifically living on the West Coast in the fall of 1941, before Pearl Harbor. After spending a week interviewing Japanese Americans throughout the 4 naval districts encompassing the entire West Coast, and consulting with Navy officers and FBI agents, Munson submitted his 25-page findings to the White House on November 7, 1941, exactly 1 month before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He reported, quote, "There is no Japanese problem on the West Coast. There will be no armed uprising of Japanese," concluding, quote, "a remarkable, even extraordinary degree of loyalty among this generally suspect ethnic group," end quote. The second report, issued in January 1942, was completed by Office of Naval Intelligence Officer Kenneth Ringel, who served as a naval attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo for several years previously, where he studied the Japanese language and culture intensely. Ringel found the vast majority of Japanese Americans were at least, quote, "passively loyal," and he argued against mass exclusion. But as with Munson, Ringel's report and recommendations went largely ignored. On April 1, 1942, copies of civilian exclusion orders were posted around evacuation zones next to signs that read, "Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following areas."
Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register.
These orders detailed how families would need to report to civil control stations and register to be forcibly removed and interned, and what they were allowed to bring with them. This included clothing, bed linens, toiletries, dishes and cutlery, and essential personal effects only. All other, quote, "substantial household items," it said, would be stored at the sole risk of the owner.
These were the orders that were posted to tell us that we had a week to get rid of all of our property and belongings and report to a station, and we would be put on a train, and they didn't even tell us where we were going. Interesting thing about this is that nowhere in the document is the word citizen. We were called non-aliens.
These Japanese Americans were doctors, shopkeepers, restaurant owners, and farmers. The majority of whom were second and third generations born right here in America.
2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents.
Interestingly, the War Relocation Authority documented some of the evacuation throughout California in photographs. This picture shows a military officer speaking with a family as they evacuate their home in Redondo Beach. This is a sign hanging outside a Japanese-American optometrist's office, who was forced to evacuate his life in the Little Tokyo district of Los Angeles. This man, Mr. Tatsuno, is seen behind the counter of his dry goods store in San Francisco, a business he ran for 40 years before the relocation order was signed, well prior to World War I. Stores owned by Japanese Americans offered pre-evacuation sales to try to sell off their goods before internment. And then were boarded up.
Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years.
Some shop owners even placed goodbye letters in their windows, thanking area residents for their business and apologizing for having to leave.
Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So, as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. Government agencies helped in 100 ways. They helped the evacuees find tenants for their farms. They helped businessmen lease, sell, or store their property. Now, this aid was financed by the government, but quick disposal of property often involved financial sacrifice for the evacuees.
Any land these people owned was turned over to the U.S. government. Who would lease many of the farms out to non-Japanese Americans. Like this family from Oklahoma that leased this farm, previously owned by a Japanese American family. The San Francisco Museum notes that most of the new owners were either naturalized European immigrants or Americans who previously lived in the Dust Bowl region of the U.S.
About half of the evacuated people were farm folk, skilled producers of vegetables, fruits, and other crops.
There are many photographs taken by the WRA showing Japanese American farm owners attempting to finish their last harvest on their land before being put in the camps. All Americans of Japanese descent were forcibly removed from the state of California altogether. And stories came out in the news at the time discussing the fact that Japanese Americans were a huge part of the state's farm labor force. The California Farm Bureau estimated that Japanese farmers were responsible for 40% of all vegetables grown in California in 1942, including almost 100% of tomatoes, peppers, celery, and strawberries. There were concerns that removing these farmers would actually disrupt California's produce industry, as Japanese Americans produce crops valued at $40 million annually in the state. Agricultural coordinator for the Japanese American Citizens League, Nobumitsu Takahashi, warned at the time that the internment of Japanese American farmers alone would personally cost them $100 million in investments in their farmlands. Many of these people permanently lost their lands after Executive Order 9066 was issued. Some 200,000 acres of land were confiscated and leased or sold under duress. A month after the relocations began, the Wartime Civil Control Administration estimated that there were still 43,000 acres of available land, and the crops on those lands might be lost if new farmers weren't found to work them.
In areas away from the coast and under appropriate safeguards, many were permitted to enter private employment, particularly to work in sugar beet fields where labor was badly needed.
Sure enough, a labor shortage did befall 1942 following the forced relocation. And in a horrid irony, some of the Japanese American internees were actually temporarily released again in order to perform seasonal farm work on surrounding farms, some of which the internees themselves had previously owned. People were prohibited from taking more than they could carry with them. And according to the U.S. National Park Service, what wasn't confiscated or sold was destroyed in government storage units. There are several photographs of the Shibuya family in the National Archives, posed with their dog on the front lawn of their Mountain View, California home prior to their evacuation. The description reads, "The father and mother were born in Japan and came to this country in 1904. At that time, the father had $60 in cash and a basket of clothes. He later built a prosperous business of raising select varieties of chrysanthemums, which he shipped to Eastern markets under his own trade name. 6 children in the family were born in the United States. The 4 older children attended leading California universities." Sounds an awful lot like the American dream, doesn't it? These people weren't allowed to take their pets with them either.
I had some rabbits. I just opened the door and let them out loose. Of course, I had to leave my bicycle and some other things behind, baseball mitt.
They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration.
During registration, the Army issued each family or individual identification numbers. These were put on paper tags and were required to be worn on each person's clothing. And also placed on their luggage. People were lined up and inoculated for typhoid,
Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers.
Then they were herded onto trains and buses and transported to their new homes in the camps.
In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all.
Thus, Japanese Americans were turned into internees, removed from their lives on the West Coast, and forcibly held in 10 military-style camps in various remote parts of California, Arizona, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Arkansas. One such camp, the first and one of the largest, was Camp Manzanar in the remote Owens Valley, California. Manzanar was once a town in Inyo County in eastern California, situated along the Southern Pacific Railroad 9 miles north of a small town called Lone Pine. The area was first inhabited by Native Americans dating back to 10,000 years ago, and was Paiute land for 1,500 years leading up to European settlement. A sign placed outside the camp by the National Park Service tells it like this: "The Paiute way of life was forever changed in the 1860s when miners, ranchers, and homesteaders entered Owens Valley. Their concepts of land ownership altered the Paiutes' freedom to move between their camps and seasonal hunting areas. Cattle and other domestic animals grazed and trampled the native crops that Paiutes depended on for food. After violence between the two cultures came to a head in 1863, the U.S. Army forcibly marched 1,000 local Paiutes 225 miles south to Fort Tejon. It was apparently a big enough issue that the U.S. Army took time out to settle it right in the middle of the American Civil War. Many escaped and returned to the Owens Valley. The sign also notes that some Paiute descendants would actually end up working at the internment camp that would later be built there during World War II. The town of Manzanar, Spanish for apple orchard after the fruit trees that were planted there, didn't become official until 1910, but it was doomed almost from the start. By 1913, the Los Angeles Aqueduct was completed. And by 1920, the city began to purchase up more and more of the water rights of the people living in Owens Valley. The orchards began to die off. Manzanar was basically abandoned by 1929. By 1933, the city of Los Angeles owned 95% of all ranch and farmland in the Owens Valley. Los Angeles then drained the area of all surface water and pumped the groundwater out, diverting it all to the aqueduct. And Owens Valley ranchers were left with no water to ranch with. This practice eventually led to massive dust storms in the area. In fact, studies done in recent decades by the U.S. Geological Survey have concluded that the artificial desiccation of Owens Lake has created the single largest source of PM10 dust in the United States. Dust storms from the dry lake bed are a significant health hazard to residents of Owens Valley and nearby areas. According to the sign, the last resident of the town of Manzanar, a poultry farmer, moved away in 1935. Without further explanation, the city of Los Angeles suddenly requested that the town be officially declared abandoned on October 6, 1941, just 2 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Just a few months later, the U.S. Army would then lease the newly declared officially abandoned town from the city of Los Angeles in order to turn it into the Manzanar War Relocation Center. Manzanar was one of 10 confinement camps known as War Relocation Centers used to forcibly house some 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II without charge or trial. Sites surrounded by barbed wire fences and towers with armed military guards standing watch. Searchlights were also turned on each night.
If the Japanese citizens did not report to the internment camps, they could be charged with federal charges. And there were a number of cases where Japanese conscientious objectors stood up and said, "I'm not going to the camp," and they were prosecuted in federal court, and many of them served prison time. So the alternative was to go to an actual jail or go to this military barracks behind barbed wire with guard towers, with machine guns. You were not allowed to enter or leave without permission or a pass. At night, searchlights passed back and forth across your barracks.
The relocation centers are supervised by the War Relocation Authority, which assumed responsibility for the people after they had been evacuated and cared for temporarily by the Army. A relocation center, housing from 7,000 to 18,000 people. Barrack-type buildings divided into compartments. 12 or 14 residence buildings to a block. Each block provided with a mess hall, bathhouse, laundry building, and recreation hall. About 300 people to a block. The entire community bounded by a wire fence and guarded by military police, symbols of the military nature of the evacuation.
Today, Manzanar is operated as a National Historic Site by the U.S. Park Service. A rather large sign placed right outside the camp has designated the highway there as a, quote, tribute to the armed forces that have defended the United States of America. If you zoom way in on the sign, there's also a little tiny addendum sign at the bottom that honors Americans of Japanese ancestry who served in the 100th 442nd Regiment Combat Team and the U.S. Military Intelligence Service during the war. The Manzanar site officially opened as a temporary reception center on March 21, 1942. It was transferred to the War Relocation Authority on June 1st, and the relocations were completed by November. According to official numbers, a total of 11,070 people were interned there over the course of its 3-year operation until the war ended. The majority of Japanese Americans who came here were from Los Angeles.
Evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Here they would build schools, educate their children, reclaim the desert.
All of your meals were regulated, all of your work was regulated, and you were treated as somebody who was disloyal to your country.
A sign posted inside welcoming visitors to Manzanar actually straight up states that President Roosevelt and other government officials would sometimes refer to these centers as, quote, concentration camps.
Special emphasis was put on the health and care of these American children of Japanese descent. Their parents, most of whom are American citizens, and their grandparents, who are aliens, immediately wanted to go to work. At Manzanar, they built a lath house and began rooting guayuli cuttings. The plants, when mature, will add to our rubber supply.
Manzanar was situated next to a working railroad, making it easy to bring in the thousands of people who were forced to come live here. It sits at the foot of very tall mountains and is incredibly remote. If someone were to try to attempt an escape out of this military-controlled zone with the barbed wire and the men with guns, there really wouldn't be much of anywhere for them to go. And weather conditions, including sudden sandstorms in the area, can be quite harsh depending on the time of year. Signs posted at the site actually discuss how people felt that they were being extra punished to be put in this specific center, where sudden dust storms would periodically suffocate people with sand. The internees worked at the camp attended school, church, and community functions here. And held memorial services like this one for PFC Frank Irakawa, the first Manzanar internee to be killed in action while serving the U.S. Army.
Yes, movie stars arriving in Washington to help sell war bonds are all working for the same cause. The country has asked the people to invest $1 billion in 1 month to help pay for the war. And here's the start of the drive. Boarding a special train for Washington, they'll tour 300 cities from coast to coast. Go to any city that agrees to subscribe at least $1 million.
People were limited to whatever they could carry when they came to the camp. And that was it. It was usually just whatever could fit into 2 suitcases.
Each family, upon arrival at a relocation center, was assigned to a single-room compartment, about 20 by 25 feet. Barren, unattractive. A stove, a light bulb, cots, mattresses, and blankets. Those were the things provided by the government. Those were the things provided by the government.
Large families of 5 and 6 people were placed in a single open room. And there are stories told by the survivors that make it pretty clear life in this camp afforded very little, if any, privacy. One bathroom would be shared amongst 300 people in a single block. Today, there are many empty slabs where the barracks once sat. But the historic site does have a few left that can be toured. Made up to look like what people would have lived in at the time.
Some families built partitions to provide some privacy.
One sign tells of how people were promised they would have partitions erected for their comfort and their privacy, but that these promises were never kept. So residents made their own furniture and would hang curtains for an attempt at whatever little privacy they could get as a whole family living together in a single open room. There's not a moment that you're in this place that you are allowed to take yourself out of the empathetic feeling of what it must have been like for these people living in this place. When you go to the restroom here, you're offered quotes on the walls about how the internees were required to shower together or use toilets right next to total strangers, with no partitions in between anything, just right out in the open, everyone in one big room. One prisoner named Mary Tsukamoto described the bathroom experience as standing in line in front of the latrine, standing in line for our bath. That was a shock. We got sick, we couldn't go, we didn't want to go. It was smelly and it was dirty. There were no partitions and it was so cramped that we almost touched each other. It was very humiliating.
They opened advanced Americanization classes for college students, who in turn would instruct other groups.
After the relocations were complete, the WRA set out to distinguish what they referred to as the loyal from the disloyal.
Relocation of the evacuees is not being carried on at the sacrifice of national security. Only those evacuees whose statements and whose acts leave no question of their loyalty to the United States are permitted to leave.
And a program of loyalty questionnaires was deployed on internees.
Now, this brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told. The full story will begin to unfold when the raw lands of the desert turn green, when all adult hands are at productive work on public lands or in private employment. It will be fully told only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish, and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good.
Throwing the camps into chaos, as the government basically stripped these people of their lives after not even accusing them of a crime. Stuffed them into these military camps, and then turned around and wanted them to declare their loyalty to the government.
We pledged our allegiance to the flag, and we, of course, ended up with liberty and justice for all. And, you know, we got so we would almost shout out the words justice, freedom, and justice for all, because we knew we were behind barbed wires.
Wouldn't be a very easy thing to do for anyone in that circumstance, would it?
One middle schooler named Tom Shikaguni wrote an essay that was critical of conscription for the Japanese Americans. And his teacher asked him to talk about the paper after class, and he said, I don't believe that the government should conscript Japanese Americans until they return us to America. The teacher replied in saying, well, you know, we're keeping you here for your protection. There are people outside of the fence who want to hurt you. And his response was, then why are you pointing the machine guns inside?
Tensions were very high in these camps.
It's not so bad until you think about being a mother and looking up at that tower and your children are playing and there's a guy there with a sharpshooter rifle. Maybe when you're 5 years old, after a while you don't see that person in that tower anymore, but I bet your mom does. And certainly some internees really talk about how much that was frightening to them, that there was somebody up there, you know, kind of looking at them at all the time. And that loss of freedom, you know, here they are, 2/3 of them are American citizens, and particularly the older of those, they're well aware of what's going on.
In Manzanar in December of 1942, the night before the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, a riot broke out near the Manzanar police station, where several people were gathered after a fight. 135 soldiers were deployed in a line of skirmish and tried unsuccessfully to disperse the crowd with tear gas. 2 soldiers fired guns into the crowd after someone pushed an unoccupied vehicle towards police. 2 Japanese Americans were killed, another 10 were injured, and 81 people were removed from the camp. The discord only grew. According to another sign at the site, on November 4th, 1943, the Army was again called into Manzanar, this time to deal with internee protests over working conditions.
Those who work are paid. Wages by outside standards are low.
Democratically elected internee leaders were imprisoned within the camp in a hastily erected stockade, and martial law was imposed until January 15th, 1944. So I guess that's martial law inside of a place that's already under martial law? In 1944, the War Relocation Authority, along with the cooperation of the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services, so the precursor to the CIA, put out a propaganda film called A Challenge to Democracy. The film documents life in these camps, attempting to placate all sides that this wasn't a heinous human rights violation, abuse of power, where the government turned on its own citizens without charge or trial on mere suspicion, but presented these internment camps as something necessary for, quote, military security. The film presents images of what was done to these people, but attempts to interpret those images with language that vastly contradicts what is being shown to viewers.
More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great. 2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents. The people are not under suspicion. They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people. The relocation centers are supervised by the War Relocation Authority. The entire community bounded by a wire fence and guarded by military police, symbols of the military nature of the evacuation. 300 or so residents of each block eat in a mess hall, cafeteria style. Rough wooden tables with attached benches. The food is nourishing but simple. A combination of Oriental dishes to meet the tastes of the Issei, born in Japan, and of American-type dishes to satisfy the Nisei, born in America. Lands that had never been occupied or farmed were chosen for most of the relocation centers. Most of the land was covered with desert growth. It had to be cleared before farming could start. Then it had to be leveled and irrigation ditches laid out or rebuilt in order that the people could produce a part of their own food. Those who work are paid. Wages by outside standards are low. The money received as wages lets an evacuee buy the things he needs, which are not provided by the government. But most have had to draw on their savings to live as they would like to. The Japanese professional men and women, most of them American citizens, had their own practices on the West Coast before evacuation. Evacuee doctors and nurses serve in the hospital under the supervision of Caucasians. The health service in relocation centers, in proportion to population, is about like that of any other American community in wartime, barely adequate. Sunday church services. Advanced preparations include carrying the benches into the barrack building. Most of the alien Japanese are Buddhists, but almost half their American-born children belong to some Christian denomination, Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian. Except for state Shinto, involving emperor worship, there is no restriction on religion in relocation centers. The first graders in this class, taught by an evacuee teacher, are making colored drawings which will decorate the walls of their barrack building classroom. The same kind of beautifully clumsy drawings that can be found in almost any first grade room. After working hours, over weekends, a relocation center is the scene of baseball and softball games by the dozen. The evacuees have provided practically all of their own equipment, for little government money has been spent for strictly recreational purposes.
It was every town USA, except that there are machine guns trained on you.
Boy Scouts, who usually provide the color guard for the American flag which floats over each center, are typical of the American organizations which are prominent in each relocation center. Girl Scouts, Campfire Girls, Parent-Teacher Association, the Red Cross. The evacuees belong to these organizations in their former homes. The Boy Scout Drum and Bugle Corps here is leading a harvest festival parade, marking the high point of the successful season of farm production. Everyone turns out to view the beauty queen, to see the well-decorated floats, and to join in the good time that goes with the full day of celebration. While they have many things in common with ordinary American communities, in the really important things, relocation centers are not normal and probably never can be. Home life is disrupted. Eating, living, and working conditions are abnormal. Americanism, taught in the schools and churches and on the playgrounds, loses much of its meaning in the confines of a relocation center.
The doublespeak employed in this video crescendos by the end of the film with this.
The Americanism of the great majority of America's Japanese finds its highest expression in the thousands who are in the United States Army. Almost half of them are in a Japanese-American combat team, created by order of the Secretary of War early in 1943. Hundreds of them volunteered while they were in relocation centers. They know what they're fighting against, and they know what they're fighting for. Their country, and for the American ideals that are part of their upbringing. Democracy, freedom, equality of opportunity, regardless of race, creed, or ancestry.
Everything we've just seen violates every single one of those principles. As the war drew to a close in 1945, the camps began to be evacuated. Manzanar was emptied by December.
Thousands already have gone. Here are a few of them. Kenneth Sugioka used to operate his own orchard in Hollister, California. Machine work was a hobby. Now it's his job. He's making precision parts for American bombers. American eggs are shipped all over the world, to Americans in the armed forces and to our allies. Mary Higuchi breaks eggs which are to be dried. American flags, some of them for the armed forces, are turned out by Mrs. Yoshie Abe. She hopes that one of the flags she makes someday may be carried in triumph down the streets of Tokyo.
Interestingly, the Challenge to Democracy film notes again and again that Japanese Americans previously living on the West Coast during the war were specifically relocated to the Midwest after the war.
Nobura Aramura is examining corn for insects in a field in Illinois. Jim Carisu used to be a clerk in Madera, California. Now he's a candy maker in Chicago. Mrs. Ayako Kasai paints miniature dolls in a Midwestern studio. Shinobu Sakuma, Joe Chihara, and Yoshio Dogen cultivate potatoes on a farm in the Middle West. This young machinist has learned his trade since he relocated to Chicago, and his boss says he's learned it well. The produce business in Watsonville, California, used to be home to these boys. Now they're in the produce business in Denver. This is Ruth Nishi. She moved to Chicago and has become a skillful turret lathe operator. Threshing oats in the Middle West is a new experience to Tet Shiota. Kei Nakadoi feeds the chickens on an Illinois farm, and on the same farm is an Issei, Kamago Shimatsu. Henry Ligoro used to be a farmer at Fresno, California. From the Jerome Relocation Center, he moved to the Middle West to make marshmallows.
The U.S. Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco would later report that these citizens suffered $400 million in losses. And yet, in the end, no one of Japanese ancestry living in the United States was ever convicted of any serious act of espionage or sabotage. Not a single person.
In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do. But of course, we hope most earnestly that our example will influence the Axis powers in their treatment of Americans who fall into their hands.
Many decades after the war ended, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, wherein the government officially apologized for its internment of the Japanese Americans.
Thank you all very much. The members of Congress and distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
The act authorized a one-time payment of $20,000 to former internees who were still living at the time the act was passed. And the government paid out more than $1.6 billion by 1992 in reparations to over 80,000 survivors. This legislation admitted in print, among other things, that, quote, the internment of individuals of Japanese ancestry was carried out without any documented acts of espionage or sabotage or other acts of disloyalty. That there was no military or security reason for their internment. That the internment of the individuals of Japanese ancestry was caused by racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And that the basic civil liberties and constitutional rights of those individuals of Japanese ancestry interned were fundamentally violated. A large white concrete obelisk sits in the Manzanar cemetery in honor of the 150 internees who died at the camp. On the front in kanji, it says, Soul Consoling Tower. While the back states that it was erected by the Manzanar Japanese in August of 1943. More than 1,800 internees died in the 10 prison camps throughout their 3-year duration. In the fall of 2019, hikers on Mount Williamson, the second highest peak in California, found a skeleton that was identified in January 2020 as the remains of artist Gichi Matsumura, who disappeared on August 2, 1945, and succumbed to the elements of what was described as a freak summer snowstorm after he left the camp to go paint a picture of the mountains. Although a funeral was held at Manzanar, shown here, his body was never recovered, as the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just days later. So he was left buried in the mountains for 74 years. Because his body had never been recovered, he had come to be known as the ghost of Manzanar. In 2020, he was finally able to be buried with his family. February 19th, the day Executive Order 9066 was signed, is now known as the Day of Remembrance. For the 80th anniversary this year, in 2022, the Apache National History Site Act was passed, designating the Grenada War Relocation Center in Colorado as an historic site.
Governor Carr said, quote, "I am talking to all American people, whether their status be white, brown, or black, when I say that if a majority may deprive a minority of its freedom, contrary to the terms of the Constitution today, then you as a minority may be subjected to the same ill will of the majority tomorrow."
As for Manzanar, one can sense the deep heaviness of what has happened here. This is not your average tourist destination. It's a painful place of silent remembrance. A place where the stories of this nightmare are told again and again and again. A place where they actually sell a red, white, and blue barbed wire t-shirt in the gift shop. There's a little book at the site for guests so they can write notes in it. And people have implored over and over in here to learn from the mistakes of our nation's past. We can only hope the lessons of this atrocity will never be forgotten. That the kind of ignorance and fear-driven insanity and division that led America to a dark place that enabled such a horrid violation of human rights will not be repeated. That these history lessons will endure so that a point in our past so abominably low will never be allowed to happen again.